Hello, Trinity HistoryCon. My name is Vinicius Marino. I am a PhD student at the University of Sao Paulo and a game developer. And today I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which is historical video games. To do so, I will start by quoting a passage from the novel The Queen's Gambit by Walter Tevis, which is about the fictional chess prodigy Beth Harmon. It goes like this. Beth sat in the green armchair for hours, feeling somehow that she might fall from a precipice, that sitting over the chessboard she had bought at Purcell's in Kentucky, she was actually poised over an abyss, sustained there only by the bizarre mental equipment that had fitted her for this elegant and deadly game. On the board, there was danger everywhere. A person could not rest. I'm quoting this not just because it's a wonderful novel about gaming, but because it says something very true about the nature of chess and games more broadly. It basically says, in a very literal way, that chess is a zero-sum game of complete and perfect information. Now, what does that mean? It means that, unlike other kinds of games, where the stakes and motivations of players are hidden from one another, in chess, everything's out in the open. You know who your opponents are and what they have in stock for you. It also means that, unlike other kinds of games in which whatever passes for an antagonist may reveal to be the pawn or even the victim of the true big bet, in chess you're in to win, and you do this by checkmating your opponent. You may dress up this game in different ways, and this will surely have an emotional impact on the way you play. However, if you scratch away the surface, you'll arrive at the same fundamental rules. This is something very important to keep in mind every time we talk about historical video games, because our first instinct when dealing with this media is to focus on what's immediately in front of us, the visuals, the types of characters we control, the narrative tropes employed by the writers, the historical inaccuracies or accuracies, and so forth. However, just like chess, if we peel away the surface, we will arrive at a series of very strict and specific rules. It is this confluence between the representational game world, those intrinsic game rules, and the way we interact with them that ultimately sets video game apart as its own medium. And I believe this is what makes games in general so great as a means of representing history, because it allows us to get systems, all kinds of systems, political, linguistic, economical, and otherwise, and translate them into other interactive systems that can be played with and even challenged. I believe this is both a curse as well as a blessing. And to illustrate why, I will give some examples from a game I am developing myself called The Triumphs of Tarlac. The subject of this game is a war that happened in the Irish kingdom of Thomond in the late 13th and early 14th century. And the main theme of it is trying to manage economic devastation caused by warfare and other sources. There are many ways in which devastation features into this game. First of all, there's a series of disaster cards that are drawn at the beginning of each turn, and they have an impact that tries to mimic the effects of a series of economic and environmental upheavals that beset Europe in the period. For example, the beginning of the Little Ice Age in the early 14th century. You can also increase devastation by raising armies without paying for the supplies, in which case they will get supplies from themselves, causing devastation in your main holding. And last, you can get devastation every time you try to feed your troops, because in Ireland at this time it was common for kings to employ a system called coin and livery, by means of which they would billet their soldiers directly on the population and let them get whatever they wanted. So every time you finish your turn with an army on a settlement, the settlement gets devastation in proportion to the size of the army. When I started playtesting this game, all of my players immediately recruited the biggest, baddest army they could find. And the result was that after just a few rounds, the board was looking like this. Huge piles of devastation everywhere, whole settlements completely destroyed, and everybody was fuming that they couldn't do anything. And they told me, Vinicius, I think you have to nerf this devastation thing because it clearly isn't working. How am I supposed to wage war every single turn if this is the result? To which I asked, well, if you knew you had to wage war every single turn, then why did you raise such a massive army in the first place? That's not how things work in the Middle Ages. And then the room went silent, because they finally learned something very specific and true about medieval warfare. Wars are expensive. Wars that are waged in times of scarcity are even more so. So if you were the head of a very small polity like the Irish kingdoms in Thomond, and you decided to raise an army of Hollywood proportions, you would just completely ruin your economy, assuming you could get the resources and manpower to begin with. Now the fun thing about this is that they knew this beforehand. I had briefed them on all the specifics of Irish history before we started developing the game, but it was just by having this information hit them in the face in practice that they finally understood what it truly meant. It was the game rules that told the story, and this is what's so magical about them. Well, if it is so magical, then why did I say it is a curse as well as a blessing? Well, because it is one thing to do this in a board game like the Triumphs of Tarlac is. We are, as you can see, playtesting it in a software which is called Tabletop Simulator due to COVID-19 restrictions, but our final product will be a physical board game. And the thing about board games is that they are a social medium at heart, and nobody can actually force you to follow the rules. If I just decided to get diplomatic during my playtests and make the rules about devastation more lenient for the enjoyment of my players, I could do this. And it's very possible that my consumers, when they get the game, will modify the games at their leisure as well. However, when we move to video games, things get a little bit more complicated, because in games those rules are written in code, which is something that historians and other humanists think is something very esoterical, but in fact is something very simple. A code is basically a set of instructions that the agents in your game will execute in order based on the circumstances and the inputs they receive. The catch is that it is a set of procedures that are written to be understood by a machine, which can get really weird really quickly. And this is because it has to be written in a very specific way, and they will always follow it to the letter. In this way, they're not unlike formal models, just as the ones you can see in other disciplines like game theory or economics. You see, if you don't believe me, just have a look at this expression here, which symbolizes the catch rate for Pokeballs in the third generation Pokemon games, according to Bulbapedia. If you want to program history as a game, you have to treat everything like the proverbial Pokeball, even if the thing in question is a very complex historical monograph full of nuances and flowery prose. This is an extremely delicate task and one that can severely skew your model towards a certain direction if you're not very careful. For example, just look at this. This is not a game per se, but it is something very similar. In a way, it is a non-interactive game. This is a kind of a computer simulation called an ABM, which I am developing as part of my PhD research to analyze how these belligerent Irish kings impacted their environment and vice versa. And as you can see, it's very similar to the Triumphs of Tarlac. As a matter of fact, I started developing this board game to get ideas in how to best develop this model. And for this particular prototype, I decided to write this code here, which basically color codes all the types of terrains in the model and gives them a different weight, representing the ease in which they can be traversed. And I asked the model to spawn 20 random mobile agents in the environment, except in the places I had labeled an obstacle. Problem is, something went wrong. And what happened is, there's a tiny sliver of environment here that's not in the same color as the obstacles. So the model just treated it as fair game. And the result of which, I now have a model that shows several Irish kings frolicking around Thomond and one just swimming in the Atlantic. If this kind of thing can happen with something as simple as spawning agents in a 2D model, imagine what this can't do if you try to take in a whole historical system in a massive game with state-of-the-art graphics. You may know about this so-called nuclear Gandhi bug in the Civilization series. And well, according to internet legend, what happened was this. The original Civilization games had an aggression meter. And Gandhi, being the pacifist that he is, he started the game with a very low aggression. Actually, the minimum one, 1. However, there's a technology that you can acquire in the game that's called democracy that reduces the faction aggression by 2. And this would put Gandhi with an aggression so low that it was in the negative numbers. Problem is, there was no negative numbers in the original Civilization games, so instead the code did a loop and assigned to Gandhi an extremely high aggression, making Gandhi into a bloodthirsty warmonger. Well, Sid Meier, the creator of the game, recently published a memoir in which he says that this is false. This is actually intended, and he put this as a practical joke on gamers. And this may be so, but I still think the story is worth is a cautionary tale for what can happen if you don't think your code through. I would even argue that even if you don't find any bugs, which will probably make you into a celebrity into the programming community, the very fact that you are formalizing something that wasn't intended to be formalized in the first place may make you arrive in unintended circumstances. For example, in this, I'm relying again on the Triumphs of Turlock. In my game, I decided to make some slightly different rules for economy for Irish and English agents to try to simulate the fact that these economies were somehow different. So the English, they have an economy that's based on metal currency. So you have coin tokens that you use to pay for things. Whereas the Irish, they have one where they use cattle as currency. Thing is, relying on cattle as your main means of circulating wealth is a little bit more different than using coins. Not just because they don't fit as easily in your purse, but because they're not a form of wealth that can be acquired at will. Cattle demands a minimal amount of grazing land. So unless you're expanding your pastures, for example via conquest, at the same time where you're increasing your herds, you will have to dispose of extra cattle because you won't have anything or how to take care of them. So to represent this conundrum, I decided to make a minimum and a maximum parameter for how many cows a given player could have. So 1 represents a completely depleted herd with just a few cows, and 10 represent that point where the king says, you know what, we raided enough, let's go home. So far so good. The problem arose when you tried to develop a formula to calculate how much income an English player received at the beginning of their turn. And we did this by relying on the proportions from the Inquisition post-mortem of Thomas de Clare, which was the main English magnate active in the region. And it says that he had some income from the holdings in the manor in Thomond, roughly 3 times that amount from his other manors elsewhere in Ireland, plus the tributes from the Irish, which, given the nature of the Irish economy, would most likely be paid in cattle. Problem is, how much cattle? And this isn't much of a problem for the English side of our historical model, because we have sort of an idea of how many cows they had. The Inquisition post-mortem mentions that the tributes from the Irish kings were worth 121 pounds, which, given what we know from cattle prices in the period, was anything from 200 to 500 cows, more or less. The problem, rather, is how this adds in with the different rules we made for the Irish agents. Because let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that we assign 1 for the value of this tribute. If we had just determined that cattle is an attribute that goes from 1 to 10, and 10 is the maximum value, then by assigning 1 to the value of the tribute, we are sort of making the argument that the maximum amount of cattle an Irish king could have at any given time was 10 times that amount, basically 2,000 to 5,000 cows, which is something that is very logical considering our premises, but has 0 historical basis. So in trying to say something about English economy, I inadvertently said something completely different and completely insubstantiated about the Irish economy. And this is the problem with formal models. We tried in our game to skirt around this issue by interpreting cattle not as a quantifiable thing per se, but rather as an ordinal scale that is relative to the means of the player in question. So 1 cattle for the Irish king has 0 to do with what 1 cattle means for the Irish king, for the English magnate. But this carries problems of its own, because if you ever need to make a formula that uses cattle as a variable for pretty much anything we can imagine, and if I, in my ABM, and if I ever make a video game version of a board game, this will be a necessity, we have to be very careful to make a separate formula for every agent, otherwise we've got a nuclear Gandhi here. And this will happen because, as I said, and I will repeat now in the conclusion, video games are formal models in a sense, and formal models are logical to a fault. If there's anything wrong, if there's anything vague, if there's anything omitted from your model, you will get a nuclear Gandhi. And if you are a developer that wants to make historical games, then this is something you strive for. It's very rewarding to come into a game with some preconceived historical ideas and see these ideas fail, and then use the games to improve your own ideas of the past and how to represent it. However, if you just like to talk and write and think about games, then this points to a very pressing methodological issue, because in commercial video games the codes are most always hidden. You know the outcomes because you can see them and play with them, but you know all the processes that lead to it. Still, I will finish this presentation by advising you, suggesting that you try, next time you try to boot up a historical game, try to look at the code as well. If that isn't possible because the game is a commercial one, try at least to think about that game in terms of coding. Try to learn more about coding, how programming logic works, and try to see this in action in the games you play. What are the processes here? What are the variables? What is the game counting? What isn't? Where are the calculations being made? I can assure you that if you do this, you'll find something you weren't expecting. Thank you very much and have a nice conference.